Thank you so much for being here today. I am so excited that you are joining us for this very timely and important discussion. My name is Ashlen Hilliard, and I'm very excited to share with you some of my research findings on reproductive coercion and cults. Just a few things before we really dive into the material today. I wanted to just real quickly remind everyone of the format of this upcoming presentation. The first segment of this webinar will be a presentation of my research, which was done in fulfillment of the Master's in the Psychology of Coercive Control program at the University of Salford, Manchester, on the relationship between reproductive coercion, psychologically abusive environments, and the extent of group identity in a sample of those who've left cultic groups. I'm really excited to go over this exploratory analysis with you, which really looks into the complex experiences of individuals who experienced reproductive coercion while under the influence of a cultic or destructive group setting. So after that is completed, then I will bring in Dr. Donnie Whitsett. She is a PhD, LCSW, and MFT. And Donnie will make for a wonderful discussant and also help guide our Q&A session with you all at the very end. So we're going to first start with the presentation, but please feel free and type and send in your questions at any time. And Donnie and I will happily get to those at the end of the presentation today. As we dive into this material, please remember to prioritize yourself, take care of yourself. If you need to step away, because some of this material could be triggering at all or difficult to digest, please feel like you can do that. And I just wanted to mention that I'm so grateful that you guys are all here and you're interested in hearing what I have to say. Some of you I know through my previous work with the International Cultic Studies Association. Some of you know personally that we've connected throughout the years. So I just really wanted to thank you all for being here. This is a really big deal for me to share my research, and it's an intimidating feat, but I'm also so happy that I have an audience of people who are willing to learn and listen. So thank you again. To be completely honest, I've done many webinars, I've presented on different topics in the past, but presenting this particular topic is one that has me quite nervous because it is so much information to be condensed down. And, I want this to be understandable even if you're not necessarily an academic. Instead of presenting this as, sort of a thesis defense, so to speak, I wanted to sort of pull the highlights of my research and my findings and lay it out in a format that would be easily digestible, whether you have an academic background or not. And so, it's a very tough thing to do, to take a very large dissertation and to parse it down that way. And so I hope that I do it justice and that it is easily understood and yet leaves you with things to continue to ponder and consider in this arena. And then as well, of course, with all of you, I feel so incredibly supported by your interest in this program. Many of you watching I know and respect, and there are some of you who are just giants in this field in particular, who've left such lasting storied histories and impressions on the field. I just appreciate your work so much, and it has inspired someone like myself to keep doing the work that I do. So, I certainly feel nervous presenting this, but I hope that you enjoy. All right, let's begin. So as you already know, I The title of my dissertation was The Relationship Between Reproductive Coercion, Psychologically Abusive Environments, and the Extent of Group Identity in a Sample of Those Who Have Left Cultic Groups. And I graduated from the University of Salford this year with my MSc. And my advisor was actually Dr. Linda Dubrow-Marshall, although I also included Dr. Rod Dubrow-Marshall, as he also helped me so much, especially with the quantitative statistical analysis of this data. So a big thank you to both of you. This quantitative study is the first exploratory analysis of the complex experiences of individuals who have experienced reproductive coercion while under the influence of a cultic or destructive group setting. I sought with this research to fill an identifiable gap in the literature by specifically studying how reproductive coercion manifests in destructive group settings. What we do know about reproductive coercion has only been alluded to from survivor accounts. Here is a brief outline today so that we kind of know where we're heading. We're going to start off by reviewing my research background and motivation for doing this work, some definitional terms, just a brief snapshot of my literature review, my methods, my results of the data generated from the study, and then leave you with discussion. I'll go over the findings and then we will turn the time over to Q&A. My research background and motivation. I have a quite a unique background in this field. Some of you already may know me personally through previous work that I've done. Others of you, you may not know about my work in the nonprofit sector within the cult recovery field. I am very grateful that I have now experienced multiple nonprofits in the cult recovery world. One of those nonprofits was focused on helping those who were leaving polygamous groups out west transition from isolation into independence. So I was a case manager, and I was really in these communities helping people just gain resources, recover from their experiences, and address trauma. And then the second nonprofit in which I worked for was the International Cultic Studies Association, in which I interacted with people from all kinds of different cultic groups and background who were also in many different phases of their recovery journeys. The first opportunity was much more hands-on and intense. This, working with the International Cultic Studies Association was much more administrative work for me, more event management and things of that nature. But what I found with both of these positions in the cult recovery world, especially with working with those who had left polygamous groups, was that women so often within these settings and communities had experienced reproductive coercion. And we'll get into a little bit about what exactly that means here in a moment. But I was continually inspired by the hurdles and the disadvantages that many of these women had found themselves in while in a cultic group setting. And it was really inspiring for me to see them excel and succeed and learn about their rights and how to implement boundaries and their worth. And it was amazing to me to see the strength of these women and them come into their power when they realized how much autonomy that they had. After experiencing those two nonprofits, I have since then completed my master's in the psychology of coercive control with distinction. I had to mention that, of course, in early 2022. Most recently, I started my own LLC after working with the International Cultic Studies Association for the past 3 years. I started my own LLC called People Leave Cults. which provides intervention services for families and victims of cults and coercive control. Patrick Ryan and Joseph Kelly with Intervention 101, Cult News 101, and Cult Mediation have been my mentors in the field for the past 3 years. And I have just so enjoyed learning and working with them. And I have just been able to take all of my sort of accumulation of knowledge and experiences and be able to put them into practice, working with families who are in crisis, who have loved ones in cultic groups, sometimes children in cultic groups. And I really enjoy being that calm presence in the room and working with mental health professionals who we bring in cases. It's just honestly been a dream come true to me. So truly thank you for all of you who have been along and who have seen my journey the past few years. It's been really exciting. So thank you so much. Here was a snapshot of my overall introduction and literature review for my dissertation. We're going to be discussing a little bit about sort of each of these categories, but I'm not going to get into depth everything that I had, of course, written in my dissertation. I just wanted to kind of selectively provide some of the highlights and information that I have learned and collected. My literature review for my dissertation covers multiple contexts of reproductive coercion, not only in the interpersonal, but also the structural domain. And I'll go into exactly what that means here in a second. But these were the questions that I wanted to sort of address within my literature review. And that has to do with what is the relevancy of the subject matter that makes this research timely and valuable. What are our definitional understandings of reproductive coercion and cults, which we covered that a little bit already? What is the prevalence of reproductive coercion, and separately reproductive coercion that occurs in cultic and destructive group settings? And finally, what intersections exist surrounding reproductive coercion and cultic group settings in the existing literature? I wanted to move into definitions and definitional terminology. When we're talking about two very large terms such as cults and reproductive coercion, I just wanted to start off by providing some definitions to these ideas. If this isn't your first rodeo, so to speak, on attending cult recovery webinars and learning about cults, you may know by now that, of course, the term cult historically has definitional ambiguity. And we won't go into the reasons for that and the varying ways in which that could be addressed in this particular discussion. But I wanted to provide a definition of a cult that could help serve as a helpful framework to help better understand the variables involved in creating totalist systems. The terms cult, totalist system, destructive group settings, abusive group settings, and psychologically abusive environments are often used interchangeably. And I know that me personally, I like to defer to however someone were to label their experience. You know, some people don't feel comfortable using the term cult, others feel quite comfortable with it, and I just like to defer to how they choose to label it. But for the purposes of this study, the definition for cult that I have chosen is a group or movement exhibiting a great or excessive devotion or dedication to some person, idea, or thing, and employing unethically manipulative techniques of persuasion and control. For example, isolation from former friends and family, debilitation, use of special methods to heighten suggestibility and subservience, powerful group resources, powerful group pressures, information management, suspension of individuality or critical judgment, promotion of total dependency on the group and fear of leaving it. Designed to advance the goals of the group's leaders to the actual or possible detriment of members, their families, or the community. And this term was coined by, this particular definition was coined by West and Langoni in 1986. Moving on to reproductive coercion, I really like this definition provided by Grace and Anderson. Reproductive coercion is a behavior that interferes with the autonomous decision-making of a woman with regard to reproductive health. It may take the form of birth control sabotage, pregnancy coercion, or controlling the outcome of pregnancy. I also wanted to break down the definition of reproductive coercion a little bit further. When we're talking about birth control sabotage, we're talking about a physical act of contraceptive interference, which may include removing or poking holes in condoms, removing IUDs, or discarding or hiding birth control pills. I was just alerted by Dr. Linda DeBro Marshall that in Canada now, interestingly enough, it is a criminal offense to break a hole in a condom. A criminal offense, which is a huge win, of course, for reproductive autonomy. When we're looking at pregnancy coercion, present as a verbal or physical form of manipulation. This, of course, includes intimate partner violence. And controlling the outcome of pregnancy is also referred to as abortion coercion. This may include the pressure to terminate a pregnancy or force an abortion. But overall, studies demonstrate that individuals' inability to make their own reproductive choices compromises their future reproductive health decisions due to fear and a higher risk for unattended pregnancy, which was noted by researchers Miller. Reproductive can affect anyone, regardless of sex or gender. However, types of reproductive control can be sex or gender specific. In the case of women specifically, reproductive coercion may be perpetrated via sex that is coercive, unwanted, or non-consensual, and furthermore uses women's reproductive capacity as a weapon against them. I thought that this was a really powerful statement used by the researchers, Tarzia, Wellington, Moreno, and Haggerty. There's been more research done surrounding cults over the past 20 years, according to Rod and Linda DuBois Marshall. And of course, the studies on the prevalence of cults have specific challenges. So researching and gathering data on cults can be considered akin to researching hidden or hard to reach populations. Of course, because of the difficulty in obtaining information and the lack of interaction with public health programs, which provides little data on this particular subgroup. And it could be considered a hard to reach population for numerous reasons. It could be due to geography, social or economic status, those living in faith communities, or those who are under social pressure from the broader community. And of course, cultic groups may fit many of those boxes, not just one. We talked a little bit about a minute ago when looking at the overall scope of the literature review, the different domains, otherwise known as structural levels, that reproductive coercion can exist on. And reproductive coercion can exist on both the interpersonal and the structural level. On the interpersonal level, this could include, of course, the source of coercion from a current or former intimate relationship, parents, or extended relationships. On the structural domain, we're talking about societal, political, religious, socioeconomic, legislative, or cultural factors that may impact women's autonomy. So we're looking at numerous sources of influence. It's very interesting when you kind of bring this discussion together and when you consider cultic environments. We're talking about reproductive coercion as sort of the confluence of both the interpersonal and structural domain within the context of cults, which we can get into a little bit later on. Prior research on reproductive coercion has typically focused on coercion from the intimate male partner, so the interpersonal domain, from research studies that have occurred in family planning clinics, healthcare settings, or amongst populations who are at a higher risk of intimate partner violence. Because of this, existing understandings in literature on reproductive coercion predominantly focus on the interpersonal domain and yield special attention to this type of coercion as being inflicted from current or former intimate relationships, partners, or extended friendships as being the source. In contrast, on the structural level, which is a much more broader area in need of further study, studying reproductive coercion, of course, involves investigating this sort of numerous sources of influence that may impact women's autonomy. There is also the consideration that individual experiences may not fall neatly into one domain that characterizes reproductive coercion. So, for example, both the influences in the structural sphere and the interpersonal pressures from extended family can present simultaneously. The confluence of these two domains can exist, particularly in abusive group settings that create environments that limit reproductive freedoms. And while existing studies on reproductive coercion have focused on the interpersonal domain, there has not been prior research on the complex experiences of individuals under the influence of a group environment, where there may be many variables that limit reproductive freedom. Specifically, how reproductive coercion manifests in destructive group settings has not yet been researched. And of course, what we have known about those who've experienced a lack of reproductive autonomy has only been alluded to from survivor accounts. So my research and the research presented seeks to fill the gaps surrounding experiences with reproductive coercion in cultic group settings. And conceptually, this phenomenon needs to be approached with a lens that can account for the many variables involved in a psychologically abusive group. Psychological abuse and group abuse often involve, of course, undue influence over the expression of sexuality, including reproductive decisions. There are many examples of this. One of those is cultic groups may impact reproductive decision-making by restricting or banning sex for group members through the teachings and influence of a cult leader, and religious or cultural factors that are significant in forming group practices and beliefs. These are just some examples that illustrate different mechanisms of control employed in abusive group settings that may limit women's reproductive health and decision-making, individual autonomy, and sexual well-being. What we do know as well is that research demonstrates that individuals who experience coercion in cults are more likely to present identity issues, depression, and anxiety in varying degrees, depending on several factors, such as a degree of identity placed in the totalist system. We know this thanks to Dr. Rod Dubrow Marshall's research on the extent of group identity. So there's a link established between psychological abuse and group identity, but the need to understand reproductive coercion as experienced in a cultic group is, of course, this relevant research area that needs continual further investigation. I wanted to highlight a little bit about the prevalence of reproductive coercion. Reproductive coercion didn't land its place in the research literature until 2010, and it exclusively focused on females who visited family health planning clinics. There was this study done by Miller and colleagues, and since that hallmark study, the majority of research on reproductive coercion has continued to focus on that same demographic subset. While reproductive coercion has the potential to impact anyone, those who identified as female, especially during childbearing years, are the ones who are at most risk for experiencing this type of control and abuse. Statistically, and 5 women experienced completed or attempted rape during her lifetime, and 1 in 14 men was made to penetrate someone, completed or attempted during his lifetime. This is research provided by Smith, Sang, Basile, Merrick, Wang, Kresnow, and Chen. Because of this, reproductive coercion has also been described as a male behavior to control contraception and pregnancy outcomes of female partners, as termed by Clark, Allen, Goyle, Raker, and Gottlieb. This viewpoint reflects the data on reproductive coercion as existing in the interpersonal domain within intimate partner relationships, as we discussed. Of course, in contrast, it's much more difficult to obtain data that exists in the structural domain in the literature. I also wanted to pause here and make a note about intimate partner violence and its intersections with reproductive coercion. Of course, one of the difficulties when researching the prevalence of reproductive coercion in the literature is the lack of distinction in terminology and its overlap with intimate partner violence, IPV, when looking at the data. Reproductive coercion is a relatively new concept in the literature compared to studies surrounding IPV by gender, which extend way back into the 1970s and 1980s. Intimate partner violence has been a crucial part of the discussion in the literature when examining reproductive coercion. As we know, IPV may occur in the form of assault, both sexual or physical. It includes physical acts of intimidation, such as stalking or deprivation, and psychological abuse through intimidation and threats. Individuals who experience reproductive coercion frequently visit medical services, such as family planning clinics, obstetrics, gynecology office, or emergency services. These visits can occur for many reasons that intersect with the phenomenon of reproductive coercion. This includes, but is not limited to, unintended pregnancy, IPV, or sexual abuse. Thankfully, medical professionals are in the very unique position to help someone who has been experiencing reproductive coercion. And a lot of studies and research surrounding this topic have involved those in touch with the medical community. IPV's relationship with reproductive coercion is a complex and often mutually reinforcing one, and it has led to reproductive coercion being referred to as IPV in the literature. Another perspective is that reproductive coercion can be categorized as a specific type of IPV. So what this leaves us with is what we know and what we don't know. So, of course, there's an identified research gap surrounding the relationship between reproductive coercion and cults. There's also no data on the prevalence of those who have experienced reproductive coercion in destructive group settings. And most of the data on reproductive coercion, of course, investigates interpersonal relationship dynamics as the source of control, mainly from an intimate male partner. This has been due to studies from Clark, Allen, Goyle, Raker, and Gottlieb, Grace, and Anderson. Of course, the American College of Obstetrics and Gynecologists recommends that reproductive coercion is best addressed within the healthcare system, where an intervention can occur if needed between patient and healthcare advisor, as documented by Silverman and Raj in 2014. However, this can prove to be an obstacle for individuals in cults who may experience isolation, cultural factors, religious beliefs, or income inequality. Cultic groups may not have any contact with the medical community. What we know in the literature is that reproductive coercion is not necessarily a new phenomenon amongst destructive groups. There are discussions and research surrounding children who are born and raised in totalist systems, their needs for after departure, as well as fatalities due to the medical neglect in psychologically abusive systems. And all this research can be contributed to Abby Mitten, 2021, Lorna Goldberg in 2006, and Asier and Swan in 2000. In the book Misunderstanding Cults, a variety of groups were highlighted in the format of case studies, with more of an emphasis on child-rearing issues in abusive group settings and less of an emphasis on analyzing the source of reproductive control over women in those settings. The Oneida community, the Children of God, and the International Society of Krishna Consciousness were some of these case studies examined, as cited by Siskind in 2016. The Oneida community is an interesting example of a Christian sect with roots in the Second Great Awakening that lasted approximately from 1843 to 1881. The group's ideology regarding procreation was determined solely by the leader of the sect, who decided whether or not couples were fit to have children. And unfortunately, the leader experimented with breeding amongst members. Women during that time did not have the autonomy to decide when they wanted to have children or with whom, for that matter. The Children of God cult in the 1960s also encouraged marriage, but would not allow women to use birth control. Comparatively, the International Society of Krishna Consciousness, ISKCON movement, mandated celibacy for individuals unless married. Then sex was for the sole purpose of procreation. So while data obtained in healthcare clinical settings helps investigate reproductive coercion as it occurs interpersonally, the experience of marginalized populations would not necessarily be accounted for. It demonstrates the importance of accounting for stigmatized and at-risk populations to ensure that they have representation in future data gathering surrounding reproductive coercion. So moving on to factors that influence the likelihood of reproductive coercion. So the methods that cults employ to maintain power and control may be similar. However, the motivations for control may be unique to the particular culture of the group. While religious or faith-based high control groups are the main types of cults discussed in the literature, it is important to note that, of course, there are many different types of cultic groups that are not held by religious tenets or motivations. Religion is just one example of a cultural factor that may influence reproductive health in decision-making. Minimal research is actually available on cultural factors that drive reproductive coercion. There is research on cultural factors that can perpetuate an environment for both intimate partner violence and sexual violence. And this includes some of the following characteristics, which are often found in high control groups. This includes cultures that approve male violence, cultures that protect the good of the group at all cost, that include power hierarchies, and of course, patriarchal cultures. This research was done by Marie Stopes, Australia in 2018. I also wanted to make note of a few research studies that were done on in-law perpetuated abuse among women. There was one study that was done on women living in rural West Africa. And it was found that the cultural views may have influenced reproductive coercion and violence against women in the region, which demonstrates the power that culture can have in contributing to the risk of reproductive coercion. In that particular culture, women would bring great shame if they were infertile or do not wish to raise children. And this research interestingly sheds some light on the impact extended family and other relationships can have on reproductive health and decision making. It's very interesting in that the influence of in-law and extended family relationships, it's not often one that we think about or consider when discussing reproductive coercion, but I think it's a really important factor that needs to be mentioned. This study on rural women in West Africa was done by Gupta, Falb, Kipepo, and Enyen. The study itself resulted in advocating that community programs educate extended family systems to help with prevention, which is a really cool route, I think. There was also research done on cultural and linguistically diverse communities in Australia, which echoed similar results as the study mentioned on West African women. Researchers found that coercion can occur from broader family structures, and that several factors put individuals at risk as well, such as, of course, the importance of shame on an individual and community level can lead to a person's experience being secondary to the family or community's reputation. And again, think about this in the context of cultic environments. I feel like all of these things are perhaps stories or considerations that we've heard of from survivor accounts. Point number two is language and cultural barriers and a fear of repercussion if reproductive coercion is reported. There's the factor of uncertain legal status of a person experiencing coercion, stress and uncertainty of unemployment and a lack of job security, lack of financial resources or access to resources, and of course, the impact of social isolation, as noted by Marie Stopes, Australia. Now we're going to segue into undue influence and reproductive autonomy. So while cults increased rapidly during the 1960s and the late 1970s, psychotherapists like Margaret Singer paved the way for more widespread knowledge about the effects of cult involvement amongst other professionals in the 1980s. The psychological impact of being under the influence of a destructive group has involved studies on former members of cults over time. One study that surveyed 157 participants found that groups that implement a restriction of freedom and enforce a punishment and reward system left the individuals with an increased likelihood of exhibiting symptoms of personal distress. This was a study done by Nishida and Kurado in 2004. And this is a relatively small sample size that was used for this study, but it certainly shows the significance when considering the effects that limiting reproductive autonomy may pose psychologically for those in a cultic environment. Psychological abuse and cultic group abuse often involve undue influence over the expression of sexuality, including reproductive decisions. Cultic groups have control over many facets of members' lives, and an area that is yet to receive specific focus in methods cults utilize to reproductively control members in the literature. Of course, more broadly, Robert Lifton, in his book Thought Reform and the Psychology of Totalism, identified 8 criteria for thought reform that cults utilize when creating totalist systems for group members. If you're listening to this and you've studied cults for a long time or you've read about cults, you'll already be familiar with this information in his book. They have already learned concepts such as milieu control, mystical manipulation, demand for purity, confession, sacred science, loading the language, etc. Anecdotal accounts from survivors suggest that cults interfere with reproductive health decisions by employing different techniques to maintain power and control. So what I did was I took some of Lifton's criteria for thought reform and applied it to examples of coercion that can specifically target reproductive outcomes. For example, if you look at my first box there under milieu control, teaching that medical services are dangerous or misinforming individuals on the cost of medical services and care they would receive would be considered an aspect of milieu control. Moving on to demand for purity, this can be exhibited through discouraging associations with anyone outside of the group, including medical professionals, because they may be considered sinful, or threatening members who wish to seek medical counseling or services with forms of punishment. And finally, my last example could be instilling that a higher power has a plan, so personal action is frivolous. Maintaining power and control in a community or in a power dynamic involving a cult leader or controlling theology may be diverse and group specific. Possible motivations that a cult leader or controlling theology may have includes financial control, sexual control, spiritual control. An example of spiritual control can be theologically driven, such as the case with the fundamentalist Latter-day Saints movement, where polygamy and childbearing are believed essential and a commandment by God to enter the highest level of heaven, as documented by Conan in 2003. I saw that often with the populations that I was working with out west, these women who had left these communities. In conclusion with the literature review, within the context of reproductive coercion in psychologically abusive environments, the common theme that I was noticing within all of this when looking at the literature is the effect of the unbalance of social power in both instances. For example, within cultic systems, group ideology, a cult leader, or the group culture itself is the source of control, which limits decisions made during group involvement through undue influence. In the case of reproductive coercion, the source of control is from the current or former relationship, parents, extended family relationships, or structural influences that intend to interfere. And again, there's that intent. There's an intent to interfere with decision making. This unbalance of social power strips women's rights to reproductive health care and well-being in the scope of this review. Okay, so we've reached the stage where we're going to be talking about my aims and objectives for this study. But the research gathered, I chose to use 3 measures: psychological abuse experienced in group scale, otherwise known as the PEGS, the extent of group identity scale, also known as the EGIS, and the reproductive autonomy scale, which I modified to fit this particular population. This research study sought to understand the phenomenon of reproductive coercion experienced by individuals who identified as female during their time in a cult or destructive group setting. And the reason why I said identified as female was because, if someone was in a group who identified as female during their time in the group, had since left and now maybe identifies as non-binary or has transitioned, I wanted to make sure that they were able to have a voice and represented within this study. Non-binary people and trans individuals, of course, experience reproductive coercion. People were eligible to participate if they were 18 and older, and self-identified as someone who had been in a cult or destructive group that they had left. They had to identify as a female while in that setting and experience reproductive coercion at that time, which I provided the definition for. These were my research aims and objectives. The first 3 of these were answered through empirical data gathered from the study. I wanted to improve knowledge regarding destructive group influence and the experience of reproductive coercion in those settings. I wanted to measure the relationships between psychological abuse experienced in groups and the extent of group identity and reproductive coercion. And finally, to investigate whether group psychological abuse and the extent of group identity predict reproductive coercion. The last aim was to generate an understanding of how reproductive coercion manifests in groups from a sampling of those who left cultic environments. And I actually, in addition to the empirical data, also provided a content analysis of the reproductive autonomy scale to address this 4th aim. Okay, we're flying now. Okay, so we're on the method, and I'm not going to cover every single one of these things. Again, it's in my dissertation if you wanted details about, of course, data management, analysis, all of those things I won't necessarily get into in this presentation. I wanted to, of course, mention my research questions, though, is a quantitative study, which studied former members of cultic groups who experienced reproductive coercion and investigated their perceptions of psychological abuse while in a group, reproductive coercion, and their extent of group identity. They completed the 3 measures, which I mentioned previously. These were some of the research questions that my study explored and ultimately addressed. I already covered the eligibility for participants in this study. An online survey was created through the University of Salford's JISC survey software. Here are the different sections that were involved in the online survey. I already mentioned the participant information sheet and the consent form. It began with demographic information, which moved into the different scales. The psychological abuse experience in group scale was developed by our Spanish colleagues and measured the participants' psychological abuse experience while they were in a cult or destructive group setting. I felt that that scale in particular was really thorough. And there was different categories of questions that were broken down. Some of the questions focused on, measuring emotional abuse, isolation, indoctrination in an absolute belief system, control and manipulation of information. This scale has strong external validity when correlated with other measures that indicate psychological abuse in group settings and include a range of questions surrounding psychological abuse, from explicit to more subtle. There is the extent of group identity scale, developed by Reproductive Marshall, Martin, and Burks, 2003, measures the participants' degree of identity in the totalist system in which they were involved. It's a 9-question Likert scale, and it asks respondents to think back to an early group membership period when completing the questions, so it's reflective. The phrasing itself is neutral, the question phrasing, to gain insight into how psychologically authoritative the group was, as noted by Deborah Marshall. Past data collected on the EGIS scale indicates that former members of cults recorded depression, disassociation, and anxiety of psychopathology, as mentioned by Deborah Marshall and Deborah Marshall in 2016. It was predicted, within this study's context, that the EGIS and the PEGs would have parallel relationships. The higher the indications of identity in a totalist group, the higher the psychopathology reported in the group setting from survey participants. So by measuring the environment of group psychological abuse with the PEGs, coupled with measuring one's identity in a destructive group setting with the EGIS, was selected to provide more information on whether the extent of group identity can predict the extent of reproductive coercion experienced in group. The reproductive autonomy scale. This was adapted by myself I changed some of the wording of the questions to find out the source of reproductive control experienced during the participants' time in a group and how that control was manifested. This particular scale was 34 questions and included 3 subscales that included decision-making, freedom from coercion, and communication. And the participants indicated on a Likert scale the degree to which they've experienced each of these factors. I added new categories to determine if the participants experience reproductive control during their time in a cultic group from their ideology, theology, cult leader, or a close relative or intimate partner while in the group. And at the beginning of the scale, it was indicated to participants that they were to, mark in the scale who had the most say in different types of decisions. It provided insight into the extent and ways former members of cultic groups perceive that they have experienced reproductive coercion, and specifically the source of that. All right, so moving along to my results. Um, this is just, again, just a brief outline. I collected demographic data. I ran a series of statistical analysis, which included measures of central tendency and variability, inferential statistics, and correlational statistics. I wanted to just kind of highlight these, but I didn't want to go into this kind of stuff too much in depth. This was a quantitative study. Many of you may not know what inferential statistics is, and that's okay. So I'm just going to kind of hit like the high points. But if you are really into numbers and data, and you want to get into the data, that is something that I'm hoping to get published in the next, little bit here. So that would be great. So initially, this project sought the participation of at least, I was aiming to collect data from 60 to 100 participants from a purposeful sampling of those who were involved in cults. The final number of participants in the research project was 99, which I was really happy with. It seemed like an appropriate sampling for this sort of initial exploratory analysis of the subject matter. So I was pretty happy with that. And the study was only online for about 2 weeks. Pretty satisfied overall with the number of participants. 92 of the respondents indicated that that they described their gender presently as female, which this also includes, of course, transgender women. 4 respondents described their gender presently as male, which included transgender men. So this indicates that at least 4 respondents had transitioned since group involvement. And that was really important to me because I wanted to include their voices as a part of this study. And that is why I worded it, during your time in the cultic group, if you identified as female, then you were eligible to participate. 96 of the respondents ranged from 20 to 85 years old, so that's a pretty big window. The average participant age of the study was actually 41 years old. Okay, this slide is something that I'm really excited about, and I'm just so excited to share with you that of all the participants that completed this questionnaire, and answered this question specifically, how long did you physically remain in the cultic group? We had 50% of participants indicated that they were born and raised in a cultic group, which is very exciting. If you've done research in this field, you know that we are shifting and starting to yield specific focus to those who are SGAs and MGAs, second and multi-generational adult former cult members. So that is really exciting that 50 of the participants out of 99, that's 50.5%, indicated that they were born and raised in a cultic group. I think that's awesome in informing our knowledge and data surrounding this exploratory research. My questions asked which cultic group the participants had left. This was not a required answer. Some people didn't want to answer this. This is a snapshot. I had 40 different groups listed that people had left, and I just wanted to highlight that here. And then on the right-hand side, you can see, the number of participants who left said group. The groups listed with the highest number of former members who participated in the online questionnaire were from the Church of Christ, Jehovah's Witnesses, and the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, also known as Mormons. All 3 of these, I found that so interesting because all 3 of these groups adhere to variations of Christianity and have origins in the Second Great Awakening in the United States, which was at the time of heightened religious fervor. If participants didn't have a group name, or if they were in a cultic family system or one-on-one relationship, they were instructed to leave this question blank. 10 participants preferred not to say which group that they had left, so this is a consolidated list of the 40 listings that were provided. I also asked a question about whether their cult had a cult leader during their group involvement. 84 participants indicated that they did have a cult leader, although 15 did not. When we're thinking back to our definition of cults, the definition that I selected on defining a cult for this purpose of this study, for this framework, I found it really important that the definition was not limited to those who had a cult leader. A cult, of course, does not have to have necessarily a leader. It can manifest in the form of controlling theology or ideology as well. So I thought that it was important to give those people a voice in this study. Those who participated in this study were located all over the world. 38 individual states were represented in the sampling within the United States alone, although the data spanned 10 countries total, including participants living in Portugal, Kenya, in the United Kingdom, Northern Ireland, Australia, Romania, Canada, Germany, Scotland, and the United States. I used SPSS version 27 when running the different measures and statistical analysis. And the descriptive statistics, including mean and standard deviation, can be referenced here in this table. For those of you who are interested more in statistics, the Shapiro-Wilk test results from the complete PEG scale was significant, with a test statistic of 0.931. And this suggests that the data on this measure was, of course, significantly skewed. And the same skew was found with the reproductive autonomy coercion subscale, with a statistic of 0.948. These skews make sense because of the purposeful sampling of survivors of abuse who were eligible to participate in the study. And the mean calculated on the overall EGIS demonstrated that participants scored low overall, indicating lower extent of group identity. We decided to still proceed with parametric statistical testing, even with this skew, to best address the research questions, and with the acknowledgement that the skewed data is likely in such a population, and caution should be expressed in interpreting the results. There were also reliability statistics run on each of the subscale of the PEGs, which included the breakdowns that we see right here, the different subscale items. Factor analysis was also run on the data on the PEG scale for internal reliability. It's included the Kaiser-Meyer-Olkin measure of sampling adequacy with a value of 0.813, and of course the Bartlett's test of sphericity, which produced a sig of less than 0.001, which demonstrated a substantial correlation in data. Through additional tests run, such as a principal component analysis, also the Verimax and Kaiser normalization method, it was decided to use the PEGs total, as the subscales did not appear to be reliable for this sample, so we used the overall total data instead of just focusing on the subscales. There were several t-tests that were run with the nominal variables on the decision-making index of the reproductive autonomy scale. The variables were relabeled according to whether participants' decision-making was autonomous or cult-led. And a two-way ANOVA was conducted to test for the effect of combined decision-making and the type of group on EGIS. It was found through doing inferential statistics that first-generation former members scored higher on the EGIS scale than those who were born and raised. This is an interesting finding, which can be explored further in future research with a larger sample, with greater power to detect a potential main effect. A correlation was carried out to determine if significant relationships exist between the scales. You can look at the following results here in this table. There was a small positive relationship between the PEGs and RAS, which is the reproductive autonomy scale. There wasn't a significant relationship between the PEGs and the RAS communication subscores. There was a weakly positive relationship between the PEGs and EGIS. And finally, moving on to the discussion section. All right, so now we're on the discussion phase. And if you're still with me after all of the numbers and data tables that were put in front of you, thank you so much. So just as a reminder, the empirical data gathered from this study sought to provide and improve knowledge on the first three aims of the study right here. And then I also provided a content analysis of the fourth aim, which I'm excited to get into here in a moment. In summation, I thought that it was really interesting that 50.5% of the participants indicated that they were born and raised in a group, and 45 out of the 99 were assumed to be first generation because of this, former cult members. The significant data findings suggest evidence that those who are born and raised in cultic groups may experience reproductive coercion differently than first generation or those in family systems or one-on-one relationships. These conclusions were formed with multiple considerations. The born and raised subgroup scored significantly higher overall on the reproductive coercion scale, but significantly lower on the communication subscale of the reproductive autonomy scale. Secondly, in this study's context, it was originally predicted that the EGIS and PEGs would show a significant relationship. The higher the indications of identity in a totalist group, the higher the psychological abuse reported in the group setting from former member survey participants. Therefore, measuring the environment of group psychological abuse with the PEGs alongside measuring one's identity in a destructive group with the EGIS was initially selected to provide more information on whether group identity can predict the extent of reproductive coercion experienced in groups. It was found that PEGs is significantly positively related to reproductive coercion, but in the absence of a significant relationship between EGIS and coercion, there was no rationale for multiple regression analysis involving PEGs and EGIS as a predictor variables for coercion. However, with first-generation former cult members who scored higher on the EGIS than those born or raised on the mean scores, this was approaching statistical significance, indicating that those born and raised may have less identification with the group than first-generation members. This also suggests areas for future study and possible adaptations of the EGIS to measure the extent of group identity exclusive to those born and raised in cultic environments. Overall, there was no observable difference between the groups when examining the PEGS results. And this exploratory research suggests that future research on a larger scale should be encouraged with this population subset. Data from the two-way ANOVA further indicated a need for future research on the differences in how reproductive coercion experiences and are perceived between first generation and born and raised former members. The decision-making question number 4 presented a high ability to predict higher scores on the EGIS, but besides this, the data further displayed a potential link between high scores on autonomy-related questions and higher scores on the EGIS scale. There's certainly a need for further research into any of these indicators, which could present interesting insights into different experiences between born and raised and first-generation former members and how they experience reproductive coercion. So after summing up the empirical data in addressing the first 3 aims and objectives of my study, I wanted to end with a content analysis that I did on the reproductive autonomy scale. This produced some very interesting data. So these were the 3 subscales which comprise the overall scale, which was developed by researchers, essential to making reproductive to measuring reproductive autonomy, and that included the decision-making index, the coercion subscale, and the communication subscale. According to the researchers, the reproductive autonomy scale offers a reliable instrument with which to assess a woman's power to control matters regarding contraceptive use, pregnancy, childbearing, and to evaluate interventions to increase women's autonomy domestically and globally. That's a quote found on page 19 of their research. I wanted to just highlight some of the most interesting findings within each category. So if we look at the decision-making index first, which was the first subscale, this index was looking at who had the most say in different types of decisions. I adapted the subscale to include 2 more options to choose from. Initially, the subscale had 3 answers to choose from on who had the most say. They could have either selected my closest relationship. This could be a sexual partner or a family member. Both me and my closest relationship can include a sexual partner or an extended family member, or me, ourselves. I also added 2 categories, which included the cult leader as having the most say, or the cult ideological, theological beliefs or practice. And interestingly, for every question in the subscale, the results indicated that the cult ideological and theological beliefs or practices were selected the most by participants as having the most say. So what that means is, while their answers varied, every question ranked the option of me having the most say as the least selected. Individual autonomy was affected by the influence of others surrounding decisions involving whether to prevent pregnancy, methods used to prevent pregnancy, when they should have a baby, or options surrounding unplanned pregnancy. This was an interesting observation because the demographic data demonstrated that 84 participants indicated that their cult had a cult leader during group involvement. 84.8% of participants had a cult leader. It's assumed that the data would point to the leader as making the most decisions, but that wasn't always the case with this data sampling regarding this particular subscale. Aside from participants selecting me as having the most say, or as having the least say, the cult leader was the second least selected on the first 2 questions of the subscale regarding whether or not to use a method to prevent pregnancy and determining the method used to prevent pregnancy itself. So what the data reflected was that the cult leader may not have influenced the type of birth control selected or methods to prevent pregnancy in this instance. However, the cult leader did have significant sway over when someone should have a baby while in the group and what to do in case of an unplanned pregnancy. Moving on to the coercion subscale, which comprised questions 5 through 19 of the reproductive autonomy scale. Participants were asked to select the degree to which they've experienced coercion on a 1 to 5 point Likert scale. 0 indicated never experiencing coercion, and 4 indicating that they very often experience coercion. Questions 5 through 9 of the coercion subscale focused on the partner as the possible source of coercion in their relationship to birth control interference, methods used to prevent pregnancy, and pregnancy coercion. The questions concerning these items are typically screening questions, I should mention, used in healthcare settings when screening for reproductive coercion or intimate partner violence. When patients frequent healthcare centers, the answer of the partner as being the source of coercion would typically be found as the answer in most cases. However, in cultic environments, it was found not to be the case that the partner was the primary source of interference related to birth control sabotage, pregnancy coercion, or pressuring the partner into pregnancy. What's fascinating is the data showed that most participants selected never on these questions relating to their partner being the primary source of control. This should, of course, not necessarily be implied that this would be the case for every individual in a cultic environment. There were still participants that indicated that they experienced coercion from their partner. However, the majority indicated that it was not the case that the partner was the primary source of control. While analyzing the coercion subscale, there was also two extremes that were found from the data, which at a glance can be seen as contradictory because they were two extremes of the Likert scale. However, upon further investigation, it made clear that the two categories that there were two categories that there were emerging from the data subset. And it highlights the extremes of sexual and reproductive issues in psychologically abusive environments. The first extreme is the requirement of celibacy in a destructive group, influenced by the teachings of a cult leader or group's theology. For example, ISKCON comes to mind, which mandated celibacy for individuals unless married, as noted by Siskind. And the second extreme occurs in cultic settings that are hyper-focused on childbearing, most commonly found amongst religious groups, such as the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, Mormons, and the Fundamentalist Latter-day Saints, or the Children of God. And as a reminder, the participants who left groups with Christian theological influences participated the most in this research study. So I thought it was really interesting that these two extremes sort of manifested within the coercion subscale. And now we're moving on to the communication scale, the subscale, which was questions 20 through 34 of the reproductive autonomy scale. The results of this indicated that communication was affected in a cultic environment, with 49 participants noting that it was not easy to talk about sex in a cultic environment. Additionally, 51 participants indicated that the cult ideological, theological beliefs would not support their reproductive health decisions. Half of all participants marked that the cultic beliefs or practices would not encourage communication surrounding reproductive health with their closest relationships, which mirrors the data found that relationships can significantly impact reproductive autonomy, as found by the study done by Gupta, Falb, Kipebo, and Anand on the West African women. And overall, one of the most disturbing findings was surrounding the topic of consent. Disturbingly, 80.8% reported that the cult ideological, theological beliefs or practices never communicated the subject of consent when discussing sexual health and well-being. In addition, 60.6% of respondents reported that they did not feel that they could have disagreed with what the cult leader demanded on their reproductive health. These findings reflect how cults can control even extremely personal issues in individuals' lives and ultimately even influence their reproductive health and well-being. In conclusion, this research study addressed an identifiable gap on a subset of the population whose experiences surrounding reproductive coercion have not yet been represented in the literature. And it may be for the reason that researching those who leave cults can be compared to researching other hard-to-reach populations. But this barrier has been lowered now because of the internet and online support groups, and because of several factors discussed that can make researching those who leave cults similar to researching these hard-to-reach population subsets. Through this literature review that I provided, on previous studies on reproductive coercion in the interpersonal domain, as usually conducted in healthcare settings, the source of coercion was typically seen as inflicted from an intimate male partner. And it's not expected that healthcare settings would ask people if they are in a high controlling group. On the structural level, certain factors have been identified that can contribute to an increased likelihood for reproductive coercion, which includes religious and cultural practices, which can exist, of course, in different variations within cultic environments. A content analysis of the reproductive autonomy scale demonstrated that intimate partner abuse can still exist within a coercive group environment, although not the primary control source indicated by the study's population sample. One of the study limitations is that participants' cultic involvement was not independently verified. However, one of the benefits of this approach is the random sampling of individuals who self-identified as leading a vast array of cultic groups or settings, which provided a range of demographic data. There are differences in approaches, and a lot of these challenges in providing are due to providing an operational definition across the disciplines on the term cult, as previously mentioned. And for this initial exploratory study, it was interesting to receive a range of responses from participants who reported differing levels of harm in psychologically abusive environments. In the context of cultic studies, professionals in the community who are in touch with those affected by the cultic phenomena can help implement harm reduction strategies for those affected by reproductive coercion through education, referrals, and resources. Of course, prior research suggests that providing education on healthy gender norms and roles can lessen the risk of violence against women in a study done by Park, Nordstrom, Weber, and Irwin in 2016. And as a reminder, when looking at instances where reproductive coercion occurs, an unbalance of social power thrives in cultic environments. Education can serve as a particularly useful tool for survivors. In the larger scope, additional research is needed surrounding the experiences of those who've experienced reproductive coercion, who were born and raised in cultic environments, compared to those who were considered first-generation members. A beneficial element for a future study would also be a qualitative analysis of individual experiences of former members who experience different sources of reproductive control. The diverse experiences of those who have experienced destructive group settings face marginalization and are often stigmatized individuals whose experiences can add a valuable contribution to what is known surrounding reproductive coercion. I want to thank all of those who've been extremely supportive in my journey in this field and also in my studies. A special thank you to my advisor for the study, Dr. Linda Dubrow-Marshall, who helped me so much with the ethics and paperwork and bouncing ideas off of and the research. And also a special thank you to Dr. Rod Dubrow-Marshall, who spent hours of his time helping me with the statistical analysis of the data. A big thank you to all of you who are watching. It is extremely encouraging to me to see your interest in this topic. Now we'll turn it over for Q&A with myself and Donnie Whitsett. Thank you so much for tuning in.